This is Kathy Diaz-Consafid, and I would like to welcome Peter Cousins he's a principal scientist from Gallo Wineries, and he's here tonight to talk about adventures in grape horticulture and botany. I would like to ask the members that are on the line to put your questions in the chat, and we might be about maybe 15 or 20 slides in, and Peter will pause and answer some questions, and then we'll continue. So use the chat, and it will be monitored. A reminder to please keep your phone or computer on mute. So with that, welcome, Peter, and we'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hey, well, thank you. And I'm so delighted to be here. Just to confirm that you're seeing a full screen picture of some grapes that look like they have measles.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, super. Then I broke my way into Zoom. Well, it's just a delight to be presenting to the San Joaquin Valley chapter of California Rare Fruit Growers. I don't remember when I first became a CRFG member, but I know that when I was a graduate student at Davis, I frequently read Fruit Grower magazine in the library. And I think when I finally scraped together enough money to become a member, that was probably about 20 years ago, and I've enjoyed reading about the many different kinds of fruits, and delighted to be presenting about my favorite fruit, which is the grape, and about the ones you can eat, and that's what excites me the most about grapes, and a little bit about their botany. So my day job is working for Gallo Winery in the research department, and the nature of the work that I am responsible for is that wine is made from grapes, and the composition of the grapes, their chemistry, which includes the pigment, the flavor, and the aroma, the mouthfeel, and other attributes. The chemistry of the wine is driven primarily by the chemistry of the grape. So an easy way to think about that is, you want to make red wine, you should start off with black grapes, because the pigment, the anthocyanin, is made by the grape. It's not made by the yeast. So the yeast has a different job in making wine. And my part of the research project is finding the best varieties in order that Gallo Winery can make the best wine possible, so that if you enjoy drinking wine, the wine is going to be delicious and smell great, and it's going to be a wine that you enjoy. There might be as many as 10,000 different grapes grown in the world. Most of the different kinds which are grown for wine. Table grapes are important, so are raisins, but they're, in terms of the varietal diversity, they're only a very small part of what people are commercially growing in terms of grape varieties. And so Gallo Winery is involved in evaluating varieties and subtypes within varieties, which we call clones. And those come from across the country, from around the world. And also, I'm responsible for developing new kinds, which have attributes that we can envision, and then we just build a grape to match those. So it would be delightful to have a wine tasting and to talk about the varieties, but that's tricky to do over Zoom. I wish that we could be tasting grapes here today, but instead I'm going to talk about first some of the kinds of grapes which grow particularly well in the San Joaquin Valley, and which in some way might qualify for the rare fruit category. And I'm going to talk about the botany of grapevines. Before I came to work for Gallo Winery, which was about 9 years ago, I was a scientist with the USDA Ag Research Service in Geneva, New York, on campus at Cornell, and I taught viticulture and grapevine biology and vineyard management, and was responsible at one point for part of the National Grape Collection, the repository there. So in Q&A, if you have quick questions for me and you saw my email address up there, then I'd be glad to talk about other parts of horticulture of grapes, like pruning or germplasm or all those different sorts of things, which are amusing and fun. Now, the San Joaquin Valley is a really fabulous place to grow grapevines because we have such a terrific climate for it. There are about 60 species of grapevines in the world, depending on how you slice them. And of those kinds, I'm highly confident that we can grow 59 of the species here There's a tropical grape that is native to central and southern Mexico, and I know that it does not handle frost well. So I'm not sure I would try that one, but practically any of the other species you could grow. Most of the kinds of grapes, the species do not produce fruit which is particularly choice. It's edible. No grape has fruit which is ordinarily toxic or even unpalatable to humans. You can pretty well force down a lot of it. But most kinds of wild grapes have small berries, we call the fruit the berry, small berries and prominent seeds, and they produce just enough flesh and sugar in order to reward the bird or the mammal, which is going to carry the grapes away and poop out the seeds someplace else, just enough to reward the animal that's distributing the seeds. So this is a picture here. You see this red lobed leaf. This is Vitis nesbidiana, and it's native to the cloud forests around Jalapa, Mexico. A beautiful ornamental grape, but the grapes themselves are not particularly choice. They're small, they're seedy. They look pretty similar in size to and characteristics to the wild Vitis californica or Vitis gordiana, which are the two species which are native to California. So you could certainly grow this grape. It's available commercially from a few nurseries as an ornamental, and it is beautiful, but it doesn't really produce fruit, which would be exciting even for rare fruit growers. I mean, I've eaten a lot of bad tasting grapes because I worked on rootstocks and rootstock breeding for the better part of 17 years, and the rootstocks that do produce fruit which tastes mostly bad. And so a lot of the wild species are like that. You just wouldn't be excited about growing them in your yard for the production of fruit. It's rare for rare for a reason, too rare. On the other hand, we can grow lots of beautiful table grapes here, and they're simple to grow, not very complicated, and they grow vigorously and produce fruit easily. Of all of the kinds of grapes which are cultivated, essentially all of the ones which would be used in any commercial production as bunch grapes, those are self-fertile and self-pollinating. So to me, that's a plus compared to pistachios or some of the stone fruits, which have various kinds of self-incompatibility. Here in our part of California, you can grow most of the varieties without grafting. If you want to get very exotic, then you can graft them for you. Like if you like grafting for fun, grapevines are not hard to graft. Most of the kinds can be grown here without grafting. And they're not very disease prone here. Other parts of the U.S., they have a lot of foliar diseases. We do have powdery mildew and trunk rotting fungi like Eutypa. You can easily manage Eutypa just by pruning them to canes. That's one of the styles of training and pruning. And powdery mildew is very easily controlled with low toxicity synthetic fungicides. Always follow the label. But that means that grapes are straightforward, they're easy to grow, and we have lots of kinds here that you can choose from. So I don't think that home winemaking is particularly fun. I would just as soon buy a bottle of wine and uncork it and enjoy the wine that way. But if you enjoy making small batches of home wine, then probably you're going to need multiple vines of each variety in order to have enough fruit to make varietal wine. With table grapes, you can have lots of fruit from one plant and enjoy lots of different kinds. Structure it out so that you've got different colors, so that they ripen at different times. And in the Modesto area or other parts of the San Joaquin Valley, there are table grapes which are palatable, if not delicious or fully ripe by the end of June. And there are still varieties which are getting ripe and which would be suitable for harvest well into November. So we have many months of delicious, fresh, local table grapes that you could grow and produce yourselves. Commercially, table grapes are picked in the neighborhood of 16 to 17 bricks. Oftentimes they're stored in cold storage, and we know that they are extensively shipped. So grapes are grown in California, they're shipped all around the world, fresh grapes from California. And we see grapes in our grocery stores which come from Mexico, from Chile, from Peru, from Argentina, from Brazil. In Europe, they see grapes from South Africa and other parts of the world. So grapes can be shipped around. When you grow them in your backyard, you can actually hold on to them until they get really delicious. Because when we're thinking about a table grape that's picked at 16 or 17, part of the reason they pick it at that relatively lower soluble solids level compared to wine grapes is because as the grapes get sweeter, they get softer, and that makes them harder to ship and harder to store. When you're growing them in your backyard, just wait until they're really delicious, because the flavor of every grape gets better as it gets sweeter. These are 2 black grapes introduced by USDA breeding program, which is based at Parlier, California. Autumn Royal is still coloring up at the test vineyards where I visited. Summer Royal is a little bit past its peak. Delicious grape. Autumn Royal makes very large seedless grapes. Summer Royal still makes a nice 5 to 8 gram berry, which is a large natural grape. The biggest berries that you'll see on table grapes, if you buy them in the grocery store, we could get some which are north of 20 grams. Those have been girdled and treated with a plant growth regulator like gibberellic acid. If you want, you can conduct those practices in your backyard too, but they do make the grapes bigger. They usually don't improve the flavor if you're looking for that. So Autumn Royal and Summer Royal. Autumn Royal doesn't have much of a special flavor. It is very beautiful and gets plain sweet. Summer Royal has a kind of a vinous character. It almost tastes like wine. You get nice flavored grapes. On the white grapes, Autumn King is a large white weight seedless, sweet but no special flavor. Princess, you will see occasionally in the grocery store. This grape, when you let it get nice and sweet, it develops a muscat flavor, which will remind you of Moscato wine. And that's because of the presence of terpenes, chemicals, aromatic chemicals, which add flavor and aroma to food products. So when we're thinking about terpenes, we should be thinking about citrus peel, eucalyptus, the smell of roses. Those are some aromatics that come to us from terpenes. So a really well-ripened Princess is a very nice grape to eat. These, again, are both seedless. These are grapes that you can find from commercial propagators. You don't need to go scavenging around in the strangest places to find these. There are a few really good grapes that aren't propagated, but for the most part, the kinds I'm showing here today are ones that you could find from a commercial propagator. Grapes are not hard to grow from cuttings, with a few exceptions, dormant cuttings or green cuttings, and all the commercial varieties which are grown in California and most of the country are easily grown from dormant cuttings. You could almost just stick them right in the ground at the site. You don't even need to propagate them in a greenhouse. Red grapes. Red Globe is a grape with seeds. It is very large, and it's one of the few seeded varieties still in production. The trend in table grape breeding is to go towards proprietary seedless varieties. So that means that somebody owns the varieties, and they're probably not going to be selling them in the individual backyard retail sector because they want to keep the production buttoned up and in-house associated with one packing house. Red Globe is, of all of the seeded grapes, it's the one which is still produced in the greatest amount. It's a very large, beautiful grape. And honestly, I don't even notice the seeds anymore. So I'm not a reliable witness when it comes to whether or not a grape has seeds from eating it. Crimson Seedless, in areas with very warm nights, Crimson Seedless will have trouble coloring up. If you are growing a vine in your backyard, it will sometimes get sweet without changing color, but if you leaf pull so that the fruit gets some exposure, that will exposure to light, that will help with the color. Crimson Seedless is, of course, a seedless mid to late season variety, and very nice texture, crispy. The trend in table grape breeding is to go towards grapes which are crisper, even as far as crunchy, I might say. I mentioned about Muscat in reference to the variety Princess. Princess is seedless. These two varieties are seeded grapes, although the grapes are fairly large and the seeds are fairly small. You can eat them and probably wouldn't even notice. Early Muscat is ripening from the San Joaquin Valley, northern San Joaquin Valley, 3rd week of July, 4th week of July. It's the standard for me when I'm training interns of what a good fresh Muscat grape tastes like. We feed them early Muscat, and the general reaction is, wow, grapes can taste like that, because we don't see very many Muscat grapes in the grocery store. Easy to grow, loose clusters. Gold is a very delicious, very intense Muscat that introduced by UC Davis many years ago. Never got much traction as a table grape. That's too bad. It's one of my favorite grapes to eat. I can just eat it all day long. Big vines, lots of fruit, very productive, very easy to grow. I spent almost 13 years working in the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, and the overall variety picture, the mix of varieties which are grown in New York commercially is quite different than those which are grown in California. And many of the grapes which were developed originally at Cornell University and which are grown in places like upstate New York or in Pennsylvania or Michigan belong to the family of interspecific hybrids which have Vitis labrusca in their background. Vitis labrusca is a native wild grape, and it has strong fresh fruit flavors and aromas. You might think about a Concord wine or Concord grape juice, and Concord is in that family. Niagara is a seedling of Concord, and Golden Muscat is another highly aromatic grape that belongs in that same family. So these are self-fertile grapes. They are not wild. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about these as wild flavors. Well, I guess they're wild because they came from a breeding experiment, but these are varieties which were developed by people. They weren't collected from nature originally. Golden Muscat is a wonderfully flavorful grape. I don't think that it's a Muscat because it's not high in terpenes. It owes its flavor to other sorts of chemicals, but it is strongly flavored, easy to grow in the San Joaquin Valley. Some of the Labrusca hybrid types don't appreciate our neutral to higher than neutral soil pH, and Golden Muscat does just fine here. Niagara is, again, a seeded grape. This is one which is used to make Welch's white grape juice. Some people would say maybe you get a peach characteristic from the fresh grapes or from the juice. And if you like the white grape juice flavor, or if you like the Concord flavor, Niagara is a seedling of Concord, shares a lot of the same flavor and aroma chemistry, but Niagara is much easier to grow here, has a better adaptation for our climate. Many people will be familiar with the cotton candy grape. That's a brand name for grapes that are highly flavorful, that were developed and introduced by David Kane at International Fruit Genetics. The cotton candy brand grape is a nice piece of fruit, but it's a proprietary variety, and you're not likely to be able to find a vine for sale from a nursery because their commercial model is that they're working with commercial growers. Marquis is a large seedless grape which has a very distinct, strong, and pleasant cotton candy flavor. It comes from the compound faraniol, which is also one of the chemicals that give pineapples and strawberries their flavor. Marquis is easy to grow in the San Joaquin Valley. It's productive and fertile, and it makes lots of big clusters of big grapes. So I've eaten cotton candy grapes. They're nice to eat. I think that they don't ship and store very well. Most grapes are better when you eat them right off the vine, and Marquis is certainly delicious right off the vine, and it's one that you can buy the vines from and have them sent to you from a licensed propagator nursery. Joy is from the University of Arkansas family of grape varieties. They've released, I was going to say many, table grape varieties, seedless table grape varieties: Joy, Hope, Faith, Gratitude, Jupiter, Neptune, Saturn, Mars, Venus, and Reliance. I might be missing one or two. The latest one is Compassion. That's a grape with a very special tropical pineapple flavor. Joy has a flavor which may remind you of plums or figs. Again, this is an unusual flavor for people who are used to eating seedless table grapes. Many people really enjoy eating Joy grapes, and they're not very big, but the vines are fertile and productive, and you'll get plenty of grapes. It's a fairly early ripening black grape, first part of August for the San Joaquin Valley. Here are a couple of older varieties introduced by Cornell University, Himrod and Romulus. There are two others in the same family, which are Interlaken and Lakemont. These are all seedless grapes. They're not very big, about the size of a natural Thompson seedless, maybe 1 to 2 gram berries. They have a flavor which is sometimes described as being spicy. They're mostly easily found commercially and popular as backyard grapes. They do really well here in the San Joaquin Valley because they're bred from Thompson seedless. They're half Thompson and have a lot of similar shared attributes of Thompson seedless. And a couple of black ones. Glenora has a almost minty flavor, unusual in table grapes, and the New York 47616. That's an old Cornell variety which was not exactly introduced. I guess I would say that it escaped through the Fruit Testing Association on campus at Cornell, and a few nurseries are now selling that variety. It does have a very wonderful, intense, fresh fruit flavor. It does have a challenge in that it tends to shell. So when the grapes are very, very ripe, if we have a strong wind, as we have enjoyed the last few days, these grapes will actually just fall right off the plant onto the ground, leaving the stems behind. So that characteristic is undesirable, but when you see them start to shell, then you just need to pick them right away. So, and finally, if you're looking for something unusual that you won't find in nurseries here in California, and people aren't likely to have in their backyard, may I recommend the muscadine grape. This variety is Lane. It's an early ripening muscadine, and for the San Joaquin Valley, it would be getting ripe around the first week of September. Muscadines are commercially grown only in the southeastern United States. They are a very different kind of grape. They have a thick skin. The skin in Lane is pretty edible and crunchy. Some other varieties, the skin is so thick that it is described as being a hull, and it's about as edible as a banana skin. You just want to spit it out and eat the delicious insides. Has a strong flavor. Some people say that it reminds them of kerosene. I think it's more like tropical fruit, but you decide. Lane is pretty well adapted in the San Joaquin Valley. Some of the other kinds don't seem to appreciate the soil chemistry or perhaps the low humidity, but Lane thrives here. Other varieties which do well include Pineapple, which is a bronze muscadine, and Supreme and Black Fry, which are large black muscadines. They look like Lane. Lane is self-fertile. Nesbitt also does well here. Triumph does well here. These are very popular and familiar in the southeastern U.S. I don't expect that these are going to become a commercial hit anytime soon in California, but I enjoy eating this fruit, and I've got about 5 pounds in my refrigerator right now, which I'm taking for my lunch every day. So I said that I would pause partway through, and this is my visual cue to remind me to pause and draw breath and take questions.
Great. In our chat, let's see here. We have a question from Shelba Durston. Can you see the chat, Peter?
I think so. Let's just see.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, she's intrigued
Okay, there
by
you
the
go.
idea of a long grape. Where can we get a list of grapes and the harvest dates, as well as places to purchase them?
Your internet is your friend. So some nurseries, like of course I'm not endorsing a specific nursery, but if you're looking to buy 1 or 2 vines, Bay Laurel does mail order. They have an internet presence, and I've purchased vines from them for my backyard, so to speak. And you know, they'll sell you 1 plant. They're also involved in other nursery business, but they are a nursery which sells retail. Most of the descriptions that you will see for varieties will give you some kind of indication of the harvest date that you can expect. It will usually say things like early or mid-season. And I would say that if we're thinking about grapes, they usually fall early, mid-season, and late. You know, the exact timing is going to vary according to how much fruit you have on the plant. So if you have a vine which has lots and lots of fruit on it, it has a material effect on when those grapes get ripe, because the leaves are catching sugar and they're going to add it to the fruit. And the more places you have to stash the sugar, the slower all the plants get ripe. So all the fruit gets ripe. So there are good descriptions from University of California, Cooperative Extension, the farm advisors in the San Joaquin Valley have posted a lot of information about growing table grapes, cultural practices, and you can usually access those through the county websites. And again, an internet search will bring up copious information on how to grow varieties like Autumn King, Autumn Royal, Scarlet Royal, Tips and Seedless, lots of information about how to grow those. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Okay, let's see here. And question is, I have a variety called Flame and fruit this year for the first time. The bunch includes red and green grapes. Yes. So why aren't my grapes getting ripe uniformly? And this is a problem, but it's not related to the climate or the cultivation. So I guess it's related to the climate in the sense that we live here and some grapes do that. There's nothing that we can really do about the way that they are pruned or trained that will encourage the fruit to ripen more evenly. What happens is that the many flowers on a grape bunch don't bloom uniformly. And when they don't bloom uniformly, then we have grapes of differing ages in the bunch. And commercially, for table grapes or even for wine grapes, if you are in a very high-end production region like Napa, the way that they account for uneven ripening is that a person cuts out the grapes that are lagging. And that's why when you go to the grocery store and you say, these all look like they're uniformly ripened, what do they know? Well, one thing is that they cut out the ones that weren't ripe. Sometimes they cut them out on the plant. And the other thing they did was they cut them out before they sent them to you at the grocery store. And unfortunately, the varieties don't ripen uniformly, and we know that from not only from looking at them and seeing that they're not uniformly ripening. In general, if you want to encourage good color on varieties like Flame or Crimson, making sure that the fruit is exposed to some sunlight during the day will help. If you expose the fruit to sun, start by taking the leaves off, pulling the leaves off around the fruiting zone early in the season, and because then the fruit is exposed to the sun for the longest period of time, and it won't sunburn. If you try to get at it late in the season, then there's a risk that the sudden exposure to our delightful San Joaquin Valley summers will burn the fruit. But earlier is better, and so that can encourage the color development. And just as a standard practice, it's not actually going to cause uniform flowering or ripening, but it can improve the color overall, and that may give you some improvement in how they look for your grapes. And the ground squirrels are peeling the skin of the grapes off. Oh yeah, ground squirrels love grapes. Sorry about that. Info on the black finger grapes. Well, if we're talking about the variety I showed, which is Joy, it's sort of a longer one, or some of the material that's now available in the grocery store, like the Funny Fingers or Moondrops or Sweet Sapphire. Those are some brand names for varieties which were introduced by International Fruit Genetics. And those are recently developed, elongated varieties. They're sometimes called ladyfinger grapes. And those come from the general germplasm of the Middle East, where there's a long history of grape growing and table grape breeding and selection, and also from the germplasm of China. And I would just say people are eating table grapes. And for a long time in the old world, the traditional varieties came in two flavors, muscat and neutral or non-aromatic. And in order to make table grapes attractive, you got to think of something. So different shapes and colors. So we have black, red, and white. There are a few other colors, but black, red, and white are the main ones. And if you can get something which has a cool looking shape, then that means your fruit is more fun. So that's the origin of the finger grapes. And they come in all colors, black, red, and white. And many table grape breeders have worked on grape shape because it's something fun. Not necessarily all those varieties are going to show up commercially, but I've had breeders show me some that look like little chili peppers or bright red and other sorts of fun looking grapes. Tips for pruning grapes and time to prune. Okay, so the grapes need a lot of pruning. Mostly we're taking off 90 to 95% of the annual growth every year. I recommend pruning early on if you are pruning a few vines in your backyard, because then you can scratch it off your list. They should be pruned before the buds start to grow. But as long as the buds aren't growing, the time of the pruning doesn't have much of an effect on the way that they grow and develop. Cane pruning is the style where we leave multiple nodes or buds per retained shoot, and spur pruning is when we prune them so that there are 2 buds per retained position. And for the backyard grower, I would recommend cane pruning because it results in a reduction in the disease pressure. Some fungal diseases like trunk rotting diseases such as Eutypa are spread into the plant by spores which move around in the winter, and those spores land on big cuts, where if you've made a big cut and cut into the older wood, and then that's where the fungal spores land and start their infection. Cane pruning is a very reliable way of reducing the size of the pruning cut, and therefore it reduces the disease incidence. It's a little more complicated, but if you have a diagram or if you have a vine in your backyard, it's pretty easy to figure out where the shoots are growing. Also, some varieties, such as Thompson seedless, need to be pruned to canes, otherwise they're not sufficiently fertile. They don't produce clusters, flower clusters, on the basal buds of the shoot that forms every year. And so if you prune them back to those buds, they're not fertile. So I recommend cane pruning. Commercially, the table grape varieties are commonly cane pruned. Same for raisin grapes. It's hard to do cane pruning with mechanical pruning. Many wine grapes in California, especially the San Joaquin Valley, are mechanically pruned or mechanically pre-pruned, and so they're pruned to spurs. But it's actually, I would say, better to do it by cane pruning. Do grapes need a lot of water for growth and fruiting? Well, they're pretty drought hardy. They're surprisingly drought hardy, but they are also very water responsive. So if you give the grapes plenty of water, they will usually respond with more growth. And if you want to encourage fruiting, then the canes and the leaves should be exposed to lots of sunlight, because they don't develop the crop well when the canes and the leaves are shaded. Here's a comment. Oh, thanks. Rachel points out that Bay Laurel Nursery oftentimes advertises in Fruit Gardener magazine. Okay, very good. I have an irregular flower grape, last rose. Oh my goodness. And it's not self-fertile. So where can I find one that flowers at the same time? Mostly they're flowering in an intense period in about the first 2 weeks of May. I don't know when the last rose is blooming here. You can store grape pollen, and you can dry it and store it. It's good for more than a year in your freezer. And if you contact me offline, I'll be glad to share the procedure for how to store grape pollen in your home freezer. My wine grapes are affected by powdery mildew. When should spraying start? With what product and how often? Okay. I am not a licensed pest control advisor, and the label is the law. That said, you should start spraying your vines as soon as you see bud growth in the spring. As soon as the buds start to grow, they are susceptible to powdery mildew. Some people would say, oh, you can spray them before that. You can. You're probably most effective to wait just until they start to grow. You can use a synthetic fungicide like myclobutanil, and that's like one of the fungicides which is present in the brand name fungicide Immunox. There are other sorts of fungicides, but that one is very effective on powdery mildew, and it can be used every 2 weeks. That's about how often you need to spray in order to keep the powdery mildew off of them. The powdery mildew of grapevine in California may be considered essentially ubiquitous. So by that, what I mean is, if you take off the leaves and the fruit, which have powdery mildew on them, you're not going to reduce the inoculum in the environment meaningfully. So when you plant a new vine, if you said, oh, I planted it here, it didn't have any powdery mildew when it arrived, and I have no other vines nearby, how could it ever get powdery mildew? The spores are blowing through the air in California. They're all over the place. We have many hundreds of thousands of acres of grapes in California, and the powdery mildew spores are abundant. So reducing the inoculum does not materially impact your disease risk. Yes, and some discussion about the natural fungicides, and sulfur is very effective. The challenge for sulfur is that when it gets hot, you should stop using it. And the good news is that usually when it gets too hot to use sulfur, then it's also too hot for the powdery mildew to grow. So when we get into that time, if we're thinking about wine grapes, it's usually the first part of July, and we need to stop applying fungicides. Otherwise, the yeast won't be able to ferment the wine. Okay, wow. All right, great questions. And we got to the end of them. Let's talk about some grape botany. Okay, in this picture of me standing on the hood of a truck, I am pulling some grape shoots and fruit out of a tree in Central Texas. So when I worked for the USDA, and I was on a grape germplasm collecting expedition in cooperation with Geisenheim University, which is in Germany, and from this trip, they built the world's largest collection of Vitis berlandieri, which is a wild grape that's used as a parent in rootstock breeding, and is one of the sources of resistance to phylloxera, an insect that feeds on grapevine roots, and also has this variety or species also has resistance to some of the foliar pests and diseases which are important in viticulture. And they wanted to have a great genetic diversity, and so they planted out more than 7,000 vines from this 2005 expedition, and they're still sifting through them to find the ones which are the most promising. So I enjoyed collecting wild germplasm from various locations, sharing it with our scientist colleagues from around the world, and learning about the amazing botanical features which grapes have. That's really how I first got interested in working with grapes, because I grew up on a tomato farm in Ceres, but was very interested in botany and learned that grapevines have interesting and amazing botany. And it's a plant that's native to North America. Let's see if I can get ahead one slide. There we go. Most wild grapes look like the ones in the picture on the left. They're small and they're black and they're very seedy. These grapes are not trying to impress a person. They're trying to signal to an animal, usually a bird, that the grapes have a little bit of a food prize and they're ready to eat. So most wild grapes change color when the seeds are mature. That's not necessarily the time when a winemaker wants to pick them. It's probably not the time when you want to eat them. If you were brave enough to eat them, they will continue to get a lot sweeter after that point. But when the seeds are ready, the grapes signal their distributing animal of choice. These are trying to signal a bird. Many of our cultivated grapes, our domestic grapes, are derived from the species Vitis vinifera, which is the cultivated grape, and its wild progenitor is Vitis sylvestris, native to Europe and North Africa and Western Asia. The variety that you see on the right is Parargun. It's a traditional variety of South Asia. And this is what a lot of grapes looked like for most of history. Big clusters. So any gardener or farmer appreciates the value of that large cluster, and it's white. So that's something we would ordinarily see in cultivation. Very, very few white grapes in nature among the species which are distributed by birds. And this one has no special flavor. So most of the bird distributed species have no special flavor. And most of our cultivated grapes are pretty similar. When you eat them fresh, they don't have a special flavor. Muscat grapes being one of the few exceptions. And the muscat does not come from nature. It is purely something which has been discovered and selected by people. We don't have any grapes from nature which are highly terpene driven. The wild grapes are dioecious. There are staminate flowered vines and pistillate flowered vines, and with one person wrote in and said that they had last rows, and it needs a pollinator. There are still a few varieties like that. For the most part, people now cultivate varieties which are self-fertile and self-pollinating. You can see this picture of flowers of Nesbit, and it has erect stamens, which produce a copious amount of pollen. And you can see that there's a functional pistil in the middle of that flower. This is an example of flowers on a pistillate flowered grape. And it does have stamens, but they're tiny and curled up and found at the base of the plant. And this one needs a pollen source nearby in order to produce crop. I can tell you from having looked at thousands upon thousands of grapevines that you can't reliably tell just by looking at the fruit which ones are self-fertile and which ones aren't. And you can have wonderful tasting and high yielding and large clustered grapes which are not self-fertile if you're in an environment where there's plenty of pollen to go around. We talk about the varieties which we like to grow, like Chardonnay or Thompson Seedless or Concord, as being self-fertile and self-pollinating. The wild grapes are being dioecious, are not self-fertile nor self-pollinating. The flowers of grapevines, as a rule, are highly aromatic, and about 80% of the pollen movement is by insects, like this fly or various kinds of hymenoptera, like bees and wasps. If you're out in a vineyard during bloom, then you'll see that there are many insects which are attracted to the flowers. In the cultivated vineyard, the insects during bloom for the self-fertile varieties have no special role. They don't increase yield by having them in there. The varieties, old-time traditional varieties that are pistillate flowered, like the wine grape, Gurk, or variety St. Pepin, developed in Wisconsin. Those require pollinators, and the way that those are grown commercially is that they interplant the varieties like, for example, St. Pepin would be interplanted with Lacrosse or St. Croix. Most of the grapes which we know as table grapes have a very firm attachment to the rachis. And this is a picture where I pulled some red globe berries off, and you can see the vasculature where that grape used to be attached to the stem. That term of art for that little bit of stuff is the brush. So I pulled the grape off, and what you see remaining is the brush. That's why when you buy table grapes at the grocery store, they come in a bag or they come in a clamshell, and the grapes are sold, they're already attached to the stem, all right? However, there are a couple of grape species which do something which is spectacular, and that is that the grapes just fall off the plant when they're ripe. These are two kinds. You can see that they have a dry stem scar. That's where the grape was attached to the plant. And I've just picked these off. The stem is still on the plant. And now we have something which looks more like I don't know, a cherry tomato or a blueberry. And the ones on the top are muscadines. The ones on the bottom are Vitis labrusca. These are wild grapes which are highly aromatic. They're attractive to mammals, which are probably foraging mostly by scent. The plant is designed to have its fruit distributed, or has evolved to have its fruit distributed by a mammal, and that maybe that possum can't climb up into the tiny branches of the tree where the grape is growing. No problem. The grapes are going to fall off the plant when they get ripe, so the possum or the bear or the raccoon can just find them on the forest floor. One of the questions which comes up in the public very frequently is, seedless grapes, where do they come from? What's the source of it? And there are two main sources of seedlessness in grapes. One of them is parthenocarpy, where there's a development of a fleshy berry, but no embryo forms. And on this cluster, you can see that there is one grape that's developing, a big one in the upper right corner. That is a grape which has a seed, and the other ones are entirely seedless. They don't even have an embryo which is formed. And of all the grapes which we grow that are seedless like this, Black Corinth, which is used to make Zante currant raisins, is the most familiar parthenocarpic variety. Other seedless grape varieties are seedless because of stenospermocarpy, in which the embryo starts to grow. The growth of the embryo triggers the development of the fleshy part of the grape, and then the embryo dies before the seed coat forms. So you can see in this picture that the USDA scientist is very carefully removing the embryo from a seedless grape before it dies, and that could be Thompson seedless, Autumn King, or Autumn Royal. Any of those varieties are all stenospermocarpic, and that allows table grape breeders now to have grapes which grow from an embryo. We could call it a seedling, but there's no seed, and it's a grape which truly has two seedless parents. So one of them is the seed parent, which is the one where the embryo is formed, and the other is the pollen parent. Seedless grapes are very popular. Nearly all of the new table grapes which are introduced are seedless. We also enjoy eating seedless bananas. Seedless bananas are triploids. There are a few triploid grape varieties, but they're pretty obscure, and none of those are grown commercially in the U.S. So you'll occasionally see seedless grapes described as being triploid. For the most part, that's not true. There are just a few. I work for a winery, and one of the very popular wine grape varieties is Pinot Gris. Pinot Gris is a color variant or a sport of Pinot Noir. And in this picture, you can see the three colors of Pinot. On the right, it's Pinot Noir, that's a black grape. On the left is Pinot Gris, that's a gray grape. And in the middle, you can see a cluster which has some white grapes. We call them white, they're really yellow or green. Some white grapes and some gray grapes. And in the very middle of the screen is a grape which is both gray and white. So the white ones would be what we would describe as being Pinot Blanc. Pinot Noir has given rise to different lineages which have different colors, and that's because of a combination of color mutations, and chimerism, particularly paraclinal chimerism. This is a picture from a Pinot Gris production vineyard, and you can see most of the fruit is this bronze or bruise colored fruit, which is the Pinot Gris. And you can see that there's a shoot here growing from that plant, which is producing white fruit. So anybody would say, well, that's white, it's not gray, but clearly it's attached to the same plant. What's going on here? And this is just a close-up. So in Pinot Gris, we have two colors genetically in the same plant. And the inside of the plant is a white grape, and the outside of the plant is a black grape. And the inside-outside layer in a boundary in grapevines runs through the skin. So if you have a skin cross-section of Pinot Gris, you can, under the microscope, you can see that the outside cell layers of the skin are black. The inside cell layers are not pigmented. And when you look at the grape through the skin, it looks like it's gray. So it's really two different genotypes combined in one grape. And occasionally the cell layers invade one another. In this case, there's been an invasion of the outer cell layer by the inner cell layer, and now the whole shoot is white. If you propagated from that, it would be stably white and fruited, and we would call it Pinot Blanc. Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris do not have the same flavor and aroma profile. Many people enjoy drinking the wine from Pinot Gris, even though it's a white wine. It's made from gray grapes, and it has a different special flavor and aroma compared to Pinot Noir. That relationship of paraclinal chimeras, which differ in their color, is not only known from Pinot Gris. Here's another close-up version. We can see a few white berries on a Pinot Gris cluster. These are the three colors of Concord. We would call them Concord Noir and Concord Gris and Concord Blanc, but it's Concord, so they got their own names. Concord is the original variety. In the middle is called Damoth number 1, discovered by Mr. Damoth and his vineyard. And the variety on the right is truly a white Concord, and it's called Glenfeld. You'll see that the variety of Damoth number 1 will occasionally revert back because the black skin invades into the middle. If you're going to be doing grape breeding like I am, the gametes, the source of the seeds or the pollen, come from the inner cell layer, and so a gray grape breeds as though it's a white grape. We can only maintain that distinctive phenotype, that distinctive appearance, by propagating the vine by cuttings or by grafting, and that's how we retain that perspective in the gris types. The same phenomenon is seen in varieties like Grenache and also in Cabernet Sauvignon, and you'll occasionally see those as well for sale. Grapes come in all sorts of amazing colors. I look at grapes pretty well 6 days a week for many weeks of the summer and early fall, and usually they fall into black, which is really for us blue or dark purple, red or pink, like you see in the upper left, and then red grapes are not very important in winemaking. We only have a few. Gewürztraminer is an example of a red grape that's used for making white wine. Mostly red grapes are popular as table grapes, and of course we have black grapes as table grapes also. White is our term of art for grapes which are green or yellow. They're used for making white wine, and then there are a few unusual types. In the lower right, that's Sultanina marble. It's a very, very pale fruited sport of Thompson seedless. And in the upper right is a bronze grape, belongs to the muscadine family. This is Triumph, and that color is not found in our typical bunch grapes. It's a very rich golden color. The grapes have all sorts of different other fun things that we see out in the vineyard. Here's one which has stripes. The stripes are really brown. Occasionally you'll see black grapes with white stripes or red grapes with white stripes. In this case, it's a white grape. Well, I would say it's a yellow grape, which has brown stripes. And this particular one has a muscat flavor. Most of the grapes which are used for making red wine are black grapes, but they have colorless flesh. For example, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Pinot Noir, Sangiovese, Syrah look like the grape on the left in your picture. However, there are also some grapes which are used for making red wine and food coloring, and those varieties have black skin and red flesh. And Alicante Boucher and Ruby Red are important commercial examples of that. This is increasing the amount of pigment in the grape by 2 to 5 times. So if you're interested in producing lots of pigment, then those are the grapes that you want. You want them to have red flesh as well. The gene which is responsible for producing the grapes which have red flesh in addition to black skin also causes the leaves to turn red in the fall. For the most part, grapes which have black fruit just have yellow leaves like Cabernet Sauvignon. And the red leaves are the result either of unusual genetics or some other sort of condition. But I consider it to be very attractive, beautiful red foliage, and it does indicate that this plant would have black fruit with red flesh. This is what it looks like out in the vineyard. Many of the grapes in this picture, which is from the germplasm collection of the USDA in Geneva, New York, like the ones behind this red leafed vine, those also have black fruit, but it's black fruit with colorless flesh. Some of the plants which are producing anthocyanin in the berry flesh and in the leaves, they just don't know when to quit, so they're even making anthocyanin inside the wood. Startling the first time that we pruned these and found that they were producing pigment there as well. This is a scan of a postcard that I bought at a winery in Napa Valley many years ago. And I bought it because it's so distinctive, and you'll see many postcards and posters and artwork for sale like this, and it looks like beautiful fall color. Well, it is beautiful, and it does happen in the fall. What we're seeing here is the result of virus infection. If you look very, very closely at the leaves, particularly in the lower right, you can see that they are curled up. These are showing the symptoms of infection of leaf roll virus, a very serious grapevine disease. The symptom that we see here is the change of leaf color from yellow to red, which is the symptom associated with black fruited vines. If it's a white fruited vine like Chardonnay infected with this virus disease, it will only show the symptom development of leaf curling. It doesn't actually change leaf color. The fruit symptom is that the grapes are less ripe, they have less flavor, they have less aroma, they are more acidic and less sweet. So it's not good. It is pretty, and it does sell postcards, but it's not good for wine quality, and also decreases the yield of the plants. That's another version of a virus infection, and you can see in this case we have these beautiful green veins, very, very attractive in that sense, but to the grape grower, this is not desirable because it is a clear warning sign that your vines are infected with virus. There's no way to rescue the vines once they're infected with virus. You can only start with clean plant material, which is not virus infected. When we're looking at the leaves, because for much of the season we don't have fruit to eat, so I became very interested in looking at the leaves when I started working on grapes and working on rootstocks, particularly many of which the rootstocks are stamen flowered and never produce fruit. Some grapevines have flecking like this. We see it on the leaves, and that's associated with the action of transposable elements, similar to what you would see on ornamental corn or some types of petunias, for example, or other ornamental flowers with flecked petals. We have different shapes in the leaves of our grapevines. The one on the right is a table and wine grape mutation. It's a shaftless ciutat. It's a laciniate or lacy leaf mutant. And on the left, this is a leaf shape which comes to us from Vitis piazetzkii. That's a wild grape that's native to eastern China. And that leaf shape is found in that species and in other species of East Asia in nature. You can even combine the compound leaf shape with the red fall foliage, and that was just a side project when I was working for the USDA to have something which is compound leaf and red, right? So to capture a little bit of the unusual appearance of those two parents. I think grapevines are very eye-appealing and could have a role in gardens, although they are rambunctious and tend to want to be all over the place. But here are some of the different leaf shapes and sizes and colors and forms, which we see in our grape germplasm. And there are many other amazing and eye-appealing grape leaves. I could just talk for hours about the grape leaves and how they relate to the different species. There's a practice of being able to identify grape species and varieties by their leaves, and that's called ampelography. Most of the common wine grape varieties have very distinctive leaf appearance, like in the lower right, that's Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's clearly distinguishable by leaf shape from Merlot and Cabernet Franc, even though they're very closely related to Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's just about my favorite leaf shape ever in a grapevine. It's a Vitis mustangensis. This particular one is native to Central Texas. Most grapes have bark which looks like the one on the right. Our typical Vitis vinifera table grapes and wine grapes have bark which looks like that, but the muscadines have a bark which is mostly smooth, and instead of falling off in long strips, it falls off in small plates, and the bark looks more like the bark of a pear tree. That is a very clear distinction between the two categories, but we don't know if there's any special functional difference in the appearance of these barks. Some people have said, well, maybe the bark that doesn't come off in those big strips is better because insects can't hide underneath it, but I've seen no data which indicates that this is true, but they are very, very distinctive in appearance with regard to their bark. This is a picture of some grape cuttings, which I received, and these are from the species Vitis davidii, which is native to Eastern China. The protrusions that we see here are really spines. They are modified hairs, and the developing tissue on the young green shoots has these. They look very vicious, but they're on these dormant cuttings you wouldn't poke your fingers. They're very distinctive. There are a few other grape species which have got some projections on the green growing tissue, but on Vitis davidii, it really persists on the older mature wood as well. You'll occasionally see Vitis davidii in the nursery trade in various sorts of unusual rare plant nurseries. It's not easy to propagate from cuttings, and so if you were going to propagate it, to me it was recommended to be grafted, even though it is available. And you may even want to grow from seeds because it's tricky to graft it. Okay, this is a grape shoot, and the grapevine does not produce two kinds of buds. Some sorts of plants have flower buds and buds for shoots, but in grapevine, there's just one shoot, and the shoot has the foliage and it has the flower clusters. And this is a typical one. This happens to belong to Zinfandel, but it's typically organized. And the habitat of a grapevine in nature is that it's a climbing plant. And what's it be on top of the world? This is a picture from central Mexico. And when you see vines there, that's grapevines. They're growing over the large tropical trees, and they want to be out in the bright sunlight. So gardening tip, grow your grapevines in full sun if you can possibly manage it, because that's where they want to be. They want to be out in the bright light. That's when they're the happiest and the most fertile. And of course, in typical commercial viticulture, this is a picture from Long Island. We don't grow them on a tree, although I have one in my backyard that's growing on top of the tree. We grow them on a metal trellis structure, and that takes the place of the tree. It gives the vine some structure. Mostly the shoots are floppy. They don't stand themselves up very well. They're counting on some sort of support, and we give it to them in the form of a trellis. The grapevines don't make adventitious buds. They only grow from where you see axillaries, and they're called out here with a red arrow. Some plants make adventitious buds. Grapevines really don't. They make adventitious roots just fine, but the buds are pre-programmed. I have a red line across that shoot. On a grape shoot, there is typically an organization where at the base of the shoot, we have some inflorescences, and those are found at the node and they're opposite the leaf. And then there's a transition point and the vine stops producing inflorescences on that shoot and it starts producing tendrils, and the tendrils grow indeterminately. So they just keep growing and growing and growing. They're again found at the node and opposite the leaf. And that's because in grapevine, the tendril is derived from an inflorescence. So you can see in this picture some structures which are somehow intermediate. On the left, you can see some tendrils with a little bit of swelling at the ends. Those are incipient flower buds. And on the right is an inflorescence which has a touch responsive element, and that's growing at the base. It looks like a tendril attached to this inflorescence. In fact, the tendril is clearly derived developmentally from an inflorescence primordium. And the main difference between tendrils and clusters is that tendrils do not have flowers, and clusters are not responsive to touch. So the tendrils are thigmomorphic. They change shape with regard to whether they're touching something that allows them to climb onto something and to wrap the tendrils around a branch or a wire, and in other words, to have support from it. When I was working for the USDA, we developed a grape variety called Pixie, which does not produce tendrils. Instead, it has a naturally occurring genetic mutation which causes the inner nodes to be very short and also leads to the production exclusively of inflorescences. So all those structures that should be tendrils instead are just stuck in the inflorescence mode. And so we have a little plant which is continuously fruiting and flowering. And you can see here's a vine grown in a #1 nursery can, and you've got developing flowers and little clusters. And if you poke around in the foliage at the base of that plant, you'll even find some ripe fruit. And there was a time when pixie vines and other dwarf plants in this lineage were available in the nursery trade. You could buy 1 or 2 plants. I'm not sure if that's still true, but I bet if you poked around, you could find some. They're not hard to grow. They're perfectly hardy here. You grow them in your backyard in a tub. They're not big, and they don't put on size very rapidly. So if you're going to pick the fruit, if it's growing on the ground, you're going to be bending over. But the gentleman who helped us to develop this plant material is growing them in his backyard in the Sacramento area. He said, "Oh, just have a wine barrel, and they grow just fine." This is a close-up picture of some Parthenocissus. Parthenocissus is a fairly close relative of grapevine. It's in the same family, Vitaceae. And what's special and different about Parthenocissus is that it has adhesive discs on its tendrils. So grapevines don't do this, but they do have flower buds. And of course, those are on the inflorescences of the grapevine. In the case of Parthenocissus, Boston ivy or Virginia creeper, those holdfast discs are modified immature flower buds. So on a grapevine tendril, there are no flower buds. That's how we know that it's a tendril. In the case of Parthenocissus, they have these sucker discs which allow them to climb right up a brick wall or to climb on a window, and those are an adhesive modified flower bud. So the grapevine shoot is a special structure which unites the reproductive and vegetative parts of the plant. And a grapevine shoot is indeterminate. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. It does not have a terminal bud like we see in many common deciduous trees. So that's the end of my presentation. I used to warn the students that I could keep doing this for hours and hours, but I've come to the end of my prepared presentation, and I would be glad to open the chat box and see if there are some more questions. Okay.
There are a few more.
There are. Okay. And we're talking about something. Name of the practice for grape leaf identification. It is called Ampelography. It's AMPELOGRAPHY. Graphy just meaning pictures, like photography. And ampelos from the Greek, I believe, meaning grape leaf. Tips for training a grapevine on a trellis. I want to eventually make an arch. Yes, so your question for training grapes on a trellis depends on how much pruning you want to do. I have helped my parents who live in Ceres to set up a couple of arches with grapevines, and my general advice is that the trellis should be as close to the shape that you want it to be as possible, because the grapevine, the natural shape of a grapevine is basically the shape of a blanket. It's whatever you throw it on. So if you said, I want to have the grapevines on an arch, then make an arch out of whatever material you want at the height that you want, and then the grapes will grow up it. And in the winter, you can just hack it back to the bottom 4 or 5 inches, and just do that closest to your arch, and do that every year. Now, that's not a good recipe for having fruit that you can pick. And in general, I would recommend against having grapes which are very fruitful growing over your head, because they're likely to drop the fruit on you as you walk underneath them. So some of the ornamental kinds of grapes, or the rootstocks, which are stamen flowered and not fruitful, make great choices. Many of those are disease resistant enough that they don't need to be sprayed, and so they make a good choice. But they do make aromatic flowers in the spring. If you do want to have an arch and have it producing edible fruit, train the grape so that the shoots will grow up over the trellis over the course of the year, so that the fruit is where you're pruning the vines to, that's at a convenient level. So you could say, look, I want to have the fruit at about 4 feet. Fine, make that the level at which you set up your canes or your spurs, and then simply train the shoots as they grow up over the arch. So over the course of the summer, those shoots will grow and produce fill in your arch over the course of the year. Inflorescence is the flower cluster. Yep, check. Is it better to interplant at least 2 varieties for better fruiting? The answer is no. There's no benefit to having 2 different varieties unless one of them is not self-fertile. So if you said, look, I love Thompson seedless, and I also love Chardonnay, and I want to have those vines, and I want to grow them side by side, do it in good health. But you won't see any fertility benefit to that. If you said, gosh, I went on vacation in Wisconsin and I had some St. Pepin wine, it's terrific. Can I get a St. Pepin vine and grow it by itself? You could, but it wouldn't make any fruit on its own. So for the most part, the varieties which are in trade in any kind of commercial nursery business that sells to retail, to backyard growers, it's going to have a special call out that this variety needs a pollinator. That's true particularly for muscadines. So Ison's Nursery is one nursery that commercially produces muscadines, and they do have a web presence. And Ison's sells commercial muscadines, so they'll also sell one vine to a backyard grower, and they are licensed to ship to California. So we don't want to have Japanese beetles here, and because of the Japanese beetle larva, which lives in the soil, there's a quarantine on many kinds of field-grown nursery stock against shipping them to California. That's good, because we don't want Japanese beetles. Ison's has a permit. They're a certified inspected nursery, and they do sell muscadine vines which need pollinators. So they're clearly call that on the website of these varieties need a pollinator, you need to plant at least 2, and these are the pollinators. But for typical grapevine varieties, there's no benefit to having 2 different varieties. The typical pollinator for grapes are flies, bees, and wasps. The grape pollen does blow around by wind. You can pick it up in pollen traps, but about 80% in the best studies of grape pollinators and pollination, about 80% of the pollination is accomplished by flying insects. And most people who are growing grapes commercially in California pay very little attention to the presence of pollinators because they do not have a role agriculturally. They are not pests, and it is not typical for grape growers to spray insecticides during bloom, and so they're not concerned about it. Also, grapes are not a particularly important source of nectar for honey production. So, good. Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure to present to the rare fruit growers, and anybody who would like, please feel free to email me, and it's just peter.cousins@gmail.com. Thank you very much.